Alright guys, so picking up on where we left off last time in terms of specificity in training for performers, one thing we want to look at is understand the concept that adaptations are specific to the type of training stress you expose the body to. What this means essentially is that arguably you could take a 100-meter sprinter and to prepare for a race, they wouldn't be running half marathons or running 10Ks for that particular race. They would most likely break down the components of the race and work on those components, like strokes, like the first 6 steps, like starting, like the arm swing, all those little components, and that's how they would improve or work on improving their performance. Now, how does that translate for a singer and a dancer or an actor when we're talking about specificity on their training? Well, if we remember, we have the spectrum of general to specific, right? So if we look at the first and more basic movements, we'll break it down into 5 components, 5 main movements. That will comprise what your general population or your general baseline are made up. So you have your vertical push and pull, you have your horizontal push and pull, you have your squat, your hinge, and then your core, which we could argue the core doesn't necessarily move, but it's a pivotal part of movement, right? It is a big player in creating movement. So your horizontal push and pull, we're talking about push-ups, we're talking about presses, we're talking about any kind of row. Your vertical push and pull, we're talking about pull-ups, chin-ups, we're talking about pressing overhead, lifts. Your squat, anything that makes your hip move vertically, translate vertically. We're talking split squats, we're talking about jumping, landing. And then your hinge, which means your hip moves horizontally, not vertically. So those are deadlifts. Speaking of hinging, we're talking about deadlifts, which means your hip is moving horizontally, not vertically. So from there, we get those fundamental movement patterns, those 5 fundamental movement patterns. As we move further or deeper into the specificity side of it, right? We move down the spectrum, we encounter 4 other subcategories, right? That are made up of combining these first fundamental movements, taking those fundamental movements and now applying some more specificities of each sport, discipline, fitness demands, and let's call it the individualization of the athletes or performer. So in those, we would have things like power. We're talking about force absorption and force creation. You have rotational movement. We have gait, and we have bracing, pelvic floor, breathing patterns, all those kind of things falling under as well. This goes back to when I speak with a performer, usually the words that come out that are often addressed when we're talking is landing, balancing, weight shifting, and lifting, right? Like partnering lifting. And those are very important words to address and to talk about, specifically because most performers will relate to those words in some form or another at some point of their careers. But to understand those and to really think about those are now looking at the further end of specificity. We're now not looking anymore at the general population movements, at the fundamentals. We're also not looking at the subcategories. We're looking more into something so specific to performing that we are now falling under the other side of the spectrum. So where does balance, landing, partnering, shifting your weight, all that fall under if you were to train those things? Those are a result of combining your fundamentals and your subcategories. And by combining, I mean being able to competently combine those movements. So that means being competent at both, not just one of them, but both. For example, landing, and we take landing. Landing is the combination of being able to squat as you descend, as you absorb, and then absorbing force, right, which is your power. Additionally, you have your core that's working on bracing and is working on stabilizing your hips and your ribs by using your obliques and your deeper core muscles, which then help you, much like a spring, take all that force, absorb that force, and then turn it around to create the force that you need to jump again or to change directions. So, well, before you may be told that in order to like work on things and improve your dance and improve those things, you have to kind of balance on, let's just say balance on the bosu and then hold something while at the same time simulating the same movements you're doing when you're dancing, rehearsing. Something like that is not more specific and is not more applicable than me asking a soon-to-be mom to change a doll's diaper while carrying a stroller and at the same time singing the ABCs backwards and pumping. While all those might be things that you could think are applicable, that never happens, and that would not make that soon-to-be mother a better mother, and that would not make her better prepared or get her better at changing diapers or pushing a stroller or being able to do any of those things, right? Then brings me to the real kicker. Performing on and moving across stage is not equivalent to moving well. That does not mean you move well. You do amazing things on stage, and the things that you are capable of as performers on stage are incredible and nearly impossible. But just because you can do that does not mean that in a fundamental level, on a physiological level, you move well. You see, athletes and performers are masters at disguising compensations, which your body has developed in order for you to be able to do what you do best. And the best athletes out there do this. It is not uncommon for this to happen. That's how most of the best athletes get what they need to get done. However, just because you are and have been successful by working out the way you work out or not working out at all, and by preparing for shows the way you prepare for shows, does not mean you do not need to learn the fundamentals, nor does it mean that you do not need to address those compensations right now. Because the reality is that most performers have not been taught any of these fundamentals. They have not been exposed to these fundamentals properly to learn and to be aware of what they're doing with their bodies. Which means if you're not competent in the fundamental movement patterns, if we remember, creating specificity in training is a combination of being competent at both fundamental and the subcategories. So if you're not competent in the fundamental patterns to begin with, those more specific movements that you're doing are a byproduct or being done and completed with your body by creating compensations that you've developed yourself. And often these compensations, often these ways of movement, you can land, you can balance, you can shift your weight and you can partner, you get all those things done. But the way in which you're doing it, physiologically speaking, the way your body's moving, very, very often compromises hips, ankles, scapular health, lower back, and your hamstrings. And that's where we get all the reoccurring and very, very common injuries, minor and major injuries, you hear very, very, very often of. So, yes, while you do need specificity in your training, you also need to address the fundamental movements, right? The key is not in landing more or working on more than the other, but in developing the ability to be able to move competently and efficiently from one side of the spectrum to the other. Now, what that does is we basically are going to establish, and what we're looking for is to establish a balance in your training so that you can give your body the resilience, the variability, and the longevity that you're looking for in your training.